The night before my grandfather's estate reading, I heard my aunt and uncle in the hotel corridor outside my room comparing notes on who would get what. I was not trying to listen. I was standing at the door with my hand on the handle, tired from the drive, and their voices came through the thin wall the way voices do when people are not worried about being overheard. My Aunt Patricia had the house. My Uncle Dennis had the lake parcel. The investment accounts were already split 3 ways between the two of them and my mother's portion, which Patricia had explained to someone on the phone earlier that afternoon was modest because my father had died 2 years before Grandpa Roy, and that, she said, changed the math considerably. They talked for 4 minutes. My name did not come up once. I stood at the door and let my hand fall from the handle. I understood that I had been accounted for already in the margins of this conversation, not present, not worth discussing, simply not a factor in what was being divided. The reading was the following morning. The attorney's name was on a card in my purse. And what none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was that my grandfather had kept a different set of books. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, the place where we come to be with people who were counted out before the counting was done. If you have ever sat in a room while someone else decided what you were worth and got the number wrong, this one is for you tonight. Stay close, because what the attorney produced from that second envelope did not just change what June received, it changed what the family had been dividing all along. Hit subscribe and leave a word in the comments, and let us go back to the beginning. My grandfather Roy Alderton farmed 130 acres of Indiana soil for 61 years, which is roughly the same amount of time it takes for land to stop being something you work and start being something you are. He grew corn and soybeans and kept a kitchen garden with heirloom varieties he had been collecting since before my father was born, a Cherokee purple tomato he had been growing from the same seed envelope since 1974. 3 kinds of dried bean he kept through the winter on the kitchen windowsill in glass jars with cork stoppers and labels in his own handwriting. He called them the winter ones. He said you kept seeds through winter so you had something to start with in the spring. I was 9 the first time he said it, and I thought he meant it literally. About seeds. I understand now he meant it about more than that. My father was Roy's oldest son. He had 2 siblings. Patricia, who was 3 years younger and had spent her adult life being the one who organized things and made decisions in the calm, particular tone of someone who has never had a decision pushed back on. And Dennis, who had come after that and had spent most of his life following Patricia's lead with the efficiency of a person who learned early that it saved effort. My father, his name was Carl, had been the one who stayed closest to Grandpa Roy. Not on the farm itself, Carl had moved us to Cincinnati when I was 3 for an engineering job and we did not move back. But he called Grandpa every Sunday and we drove to Clover Falls 3 or 4 times a year. And I spent 2 full summers on the farm when I was in high school. The kind of summers that print themselves on you in the specific way that only the best ones do, before you understand that they are doing it. Those summers I worked alongside my grandfather from morning until the light gave out. He was methodical and patient about teaching the way a man is patient when he has been at something long enough to know what a person needs and what they do not. He showed me how to read soil by its color, and how it broke in the hand. He showed me which rows the deer came in from, and which corner posts were about to go soft, and how to walk a fence line without hurrying it. He showed me the seed jars on the kitchen windowsill and told me the name of every variety, and where each one had come from, and what it needed, and what it gave back. In the last days of my second summer before I drove back to Cincinnati for my senior year, he pressed one of the jars into my hands, the Cherokee purple, with his handwriting on the label, and he said, "These grow back no matter what. Take this so you have something to start with." I put the jar on every kitchen windowsill I ever had after that. The apartment in Columbus after nursing school. The house in Louisville I lived in for 4 years. The small rental in Clover Falls I had taken the previous year when I moved back to be closer to Grandpa in what we both understood, without discussing it directly, was the final stretch. The jar traveled with me the way the things you were given young travel with you, not because you make a conscious decision to keep them, but because the idea of leaving them somewhere never occurs to you. My mother Carol was a person of considerable grace and limited resources, which is a combination I have a great deal of respect for. She had worked as a bookkeeper for a local firm in Cincinnati for 30 years, and she was precise and steady, and she had raised me to be the same. When my father Carl died, suddenly, a hard event on a Tuesday morning in March 2 years before Grandpa Roy, my mother carried it the way she carried everything, which was upright and without display. She told me the first week, "We are going to be sad about this for a long time, June," and that is exactly right. She was correct about both things. My father's death changed the family dynamic in ways I understood slowly, because grief does not present its full shape at once. What I understood right away was that Carl had been the bridge between Grandpa Roy and the rest of the family. The one who knew his father's mind, who had the Sunday phone calls, who understood what the farm meant to Roy in a way that Patricia and Dennis had not chosen to make the effort to understand. When Carl died, that bridge went with him. And Patricia and Dennis moved into the space that opened up with the specific efficiency of people who see an opportunity inside a loss. I watched this happen from close enough to see it clearly and far enough that nobody was watching me watch. Patricia began calling Grandpa Roy weekly. Dennis began driving up more often. They were not unkind to him in the ways you could point to directly. They were attentive. They drove him to doctor's appointments and sat with him at dinner and discussed, in his presence, the farm's current market value and what sensible people did with that kind of acreage in a rising real estate market. A developer from Indianapolis had already approached 2 neighboring farms about a light residential rezoning. The timing, Patricia said more than once in the particular tone she used when she had already made a decision, was excellent. I called Grandpa Roy on Sundays, the way my father had. He did not always have a lot of energy in those last months, but he was present on the phone, fully himself, specific about the things he was specific about. He asked about my work. I had been a physical therapist for 8 years, and he found the work genuinely interesting in the way he found most practical things interesting. And he would ask about specific patients with the same care he had always asked about specific rows in a field. He asked about the seed jar every time. Every single time. I always told him it was on the windowsill. He always said good. He died on a Friday morning in April at 84, in his own bed, in the farmhouse he had lived in for 59 years. I was in the house. I had come up the week before because his breathing had changed, and I wanted to be there. Patricia arrived the day after I did. Dennis the day after that. We were all in the house when he went. Whatever else is true about this family, we were all present for that morning. It matters, and I have tried not to let the rest of the story make me forget it. The estate reading was scheduled for the following Thursday, in the office of Lawrence Hebb, who had been the primary estate attorney in Clover Falls for 30 years, and who had handled Roy Alderton's affairs for at least 20 of them. His office was a suite above the hardware store on Main Street, with wood-paneled walls and a conference table that seated 8, and the particular smell of a room where serious things have been said many times before. I drove over on a Thursday morning in April. The seed jar was on my kitchen windowsill. I had looked at it before I left. I parked on Main Street and sat in the car for a moment. The morning was cold and clear, and the kind of April in Indiana that reminds you winter was serious about itself. I watched a man walk a dog on the sidewalk across the street, and I thought about my grandfather showing me how to walk a fence line and where to look at the corners. I thought, whatever happens in that room, he knew what he was doing. He always knew what he was doing. I went inside. The conference table was set with a folder at each chair. My mother Carol sat beside me. Across the table were Patricia and her husband Jeff, who had driven from Columbus. Dennis sat next to them with a yellow legal pad, which I noted because Dennis did not typically take notes unless he planned to refer to them. Lawrence Hebb sat at the head of the table with a file considerably thicker than the folders in front of us. He began with the customary preamble. validity of the document, date of execution, the decident's sound mind, all of which were true and uncontested. And then he read the will. The will was thorough. Roy Alderton had been thorough about everything his whole life. His personal property, furniture, equipment, tools, household items, was to be divided equally among his 3 children or their heirs. The cash savings account, amounting to $41,000, was split in thirds: 1/3 to Patricia, 1/3 to Dennis, 1/3 to my mother as Carl's heir. The investment portfolio, valued at approximately $186,000, was distributed the same way. A modest insurance policy went to a local church. There was a bequest to Vera Moss, his neighbor of 41 years, which I noted but did not dwell on at the time, though I would think about it later. Lawrence Hebb read all of it. Patricia was still. Dennis had his pen on the legal pad but was not writing yet. My mother held her hands in her lap. And then Lawrence Hebb reached the end of the will's provisions and he stopped. He said, "The farm property, consisting of 130 acres as described in the survey of March 2019, and the farmhouse and all outbuildings thereon, is not addressed in this instrument." The room went still in the specific way a room goes still when every person at the table has heard the same sentence and is processing it differently. Dennis put his pen down. Patricia leaned forward by about an inch. Lawrence Hebb said, "The farm property was placed in a separate irrevocable trust 3 years ago. The trust has its own documentation and its own designated beneficiary." He said it with the complete composure of a man who had been waiting for this exact moment in the proceedings and had not been concerned about it. Patricia said, "What trust?" Not a question. The statement of a person who has just been told that something they counted on is not where they put it. Lawrence Hebb said the Alderton Farm Trust, executed in April of the year before last. Properly witnessed and recorded with this county. He reached for a second envelope that had been sitting to his right, beneath the main file folder, set apart from everything else, and he placed it on the center of the table. He said, "The designated beneficiary of the Alderton Farm Trust is June Carroll Alderton." I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because the story is not worth telling if I am not. What I felt was not triumph. What I felt was my grandfather's hands, the specific image of them, large and brown and careful, 60 years of work in them. And then I felt something that took me a second to name because I had not expected to feel it in an attorney's conference room above a hardware store. I felt known. The way a person feels when they have been wondering for a long time whether anyone was paying attention, and find out that someone was. Patricia said, "That is not possible." Lawrence Hebb said, "I assure you it is." He opened the second envelope steadily, without drama. Dennis said something to Patricia in a low voice I could not fully hear, but whose shape I recognized, the shape of a man recalculating. My mother put her hand over mine on the table. She did not say anything. She just put it there. The trust document was 14 pages. Lawrence summarized the operative provisions rather than reading the whole instrument. The summary was this. My grandfather had established an irrevocable trust in April 3 years prior, at which time he was 83 years old and in sufficient health to drive himself to Lawrence's office and sign the documents without assistance. The trust held the farm property in its entirety, the 130 acres, the farmhouse, every outbuilding. It was established independently of the main will, with instructions that it be disclosed at the time of the estate reading. The sole beneficiary was me. My grandfather had done this before his health declined, before Patricia's weekly calls, before Dennis's more frequent visits. 3 years before he died, when the farm was entirely his and the silence around him had not yet been filled with attentive relatives. He had looked at the shape of his family and his land and his granddaughter, and he had made a decision. He had written it down in the only language that could not be argued with. Patricia was completely still. The stillness of a person who has just realized that the calculation they made was based on a number that was never in the equation. She said, "Did you know about this?" She was looking at me. I said no. I heard it when you did. She looked at Lawrence Hebb. She said, "When was this executed?" He gave her the date. She said, "And he did this without telling anyone." Lawrence Hebb said he was under no legal obligation to disclose the contents of a trust to any party prior to his death. The trust was properly executed and witnessed and has been on file with this office for 3 years. Patricia said she would like a copy of the document. Lawrence said of course. Dennis had stopped writing on the legal pad. He was looking at the table with the expression of a man who came in expecting one outcome and is doing arithmetic in his head in front of everyone. He understood what the farm represented as a proportion of the estate they had been planning around. The investment accounts and the cash savings were genuine and truly theirs, and not insignificant. But the farm, 130 acres of Indiana ground in a county where a developer was already mapping the neighboring parcels, was not. It was mine. It had been mine for 3 years without my knowing. My grandfather had ensured I would find out at the same table where everyone else found out, at the same moment, so that no one could get to me first with a version of what it meant. That was not an accident. He had been precise about everything his whole life. He was precise about this. If you have ever sat in a room where someone produced a document that changed the whole accounting, leave a word below. Subscribe and stay close, because what Patricia says later, not in that room but at the farm, is what I have been building toward. Back to it. I want to tell you about Vera Moss, because without Vera, what followed would have been harder than it was. Vera was 79 and had lived in the white farmhouse across the county road from my grandfather for 41 years. She had been a 4th-grade teacher in the Clover Falls district for 32 of those years, and she had the bearing of a person who has spent decades in a room with children learning and had not once lost her composure about it. She had been at the estate reading, 2 chairs down from my mother, and I had nodded to her when I came in. After the reading ended, after Patricia had requested the document copies, and Lawrence had assured everyone of the process going forward, and the room began to gather itself back into ordinary life, Vera came to me. She waited until the others had moved toward the door, and then she came to stand beside me, and she said, "He asked me to tell you that the seed jar on his windowsill is the same one he kept from your first summer. He thought you should know they were a pair." I looked at her. She said, "He asked me to witness the trust." I was one of the 2 witnesses. Lawrence was the other. I said, "Did he tell you why he did it this way? The second envelope, the reading?" She said, "He told me he wanted you to find out in the room with everyone present, so there was nothing anyone could do about it before you knew. He said he knew how Patricia operated, and he did not want her to get to you first with her version of what it meant." She paused. He also said, and I want you to hear this exactly as he said it, that he was not doing this out of anger. He was doing it because the land deserved someone who would keep it. I sat back down at the conference table. The room had emptied. My mother came and sat with me without asking if I needed her to, which is how she has always operated. Vera pulled out her chair and sat down too, and the 3 of us were at the table in the quiet wood-paneled room, and I thought about 61 years of farming and a seed jar, and a man who had watched his fields and his family with the same patient attention, and had seen what he saw. He had seen me. He had been seeing me for 30 years. And when the time came, he had put it in writing. The days after the reading were not peaceful. Patricia called twice. I did not answer, and I let Lawrence advise me, which was to let the legal process work and not engage with informal pressure before the estate period formally resolved. My mother relayed, from her own conversations with Patricia, that Patricia's position was that the trust was the product of undue influence. That someone had persuaded Roy to make a decision he would not otherwise have made. The fact that the trust predated the period of Patricia's own increased attention to Roy by roughly the same margin as it predated the date of execution was not something Patricia was prepared to make room for in this argument. Dennis called my mother. He said he thought there must be a way to resolve this fairly. He said fair the way people say it when they mean differently than it went. My mother said she understood he was disappointed and would pass his feelings along. Patricia filed a formal contest to the trust 6 weeks after the estate reading. Her attorney sent a letter to Lawrence Hebb claiming execution during diminished capacity and naming Vera Moss as the party responsible for undue influence. Vera, who had brought my grandfather soup when he had the flu in 2019 and who had crossed a county road to sign her name on a legal document as one neighbor does for another, was the named party in a trust contest. I want that to sit for a moment. Lawrence had anticipated the contest. My grandfather had also anticipated it, because he had arranged at the time of the trust's execution for his primary care physician to write a letter confirming that Roy Alderton was in full cognitive possession of his faculties on the date of the appointment. He had also arranged, separately, for an independent cognitive assessment, results attached to the trust file. This was not standard practice for a trust execution. It was the practice of a man who knew his family and had been precise about closing the argument before anyone could open it. Lawrence provided these materials to Patricia's attorney. The contest was withdrawn in 8 weeks. Vera came for Sunday dinner the week it resolved. She came the week after that. By July she came because it was simply what she did, the way certain people arrive and stay. She brought things from her kitchen and her garden, and she never made a production of it. She was there. That was the whole of it. Go to the comments right now if you know what it means to have someone simply show up. Leave one word, subscribe, and stay with me because Patricia will come to the farm in September, and what happens on that porch matters more than what happened in the attorney's office. Now, back to it. The farm had not been actively worked in 2 years. My grandfather had leased the acreage to a neighboring family, the Clements, who had farmed their own land across the section road for 3 generations. And the fields were in reasonable condition, but the farmhouse and outbuildings had been quiet, and the kitchen garden had gone to weeds along the south fence line. I walked the full property the week the trust formally transferred to my name. 130 acres on a May morning, the fields still damp from the night before. The soil the particular dark color it gets when the moisture is right. I had not walked a fence line in 15 years. My body remembered it anyway. The farmhouse needed work. Not catastrophic work, Roy had maintained it, but the kind of work that accumulates when a man in his 80s has been doing what he can, and the things he can no longer quite manage have been waiting quietly. I made a list. I started at the top. I am not a farmer, and I want to say that plainly. I am a physical therapist who spent 2 summers learning from a man who was one of the best farmers I have ever known. I was not equipped to run 130 acres of Indiana ground by myself, and I did not try. I continued the lease arrangement with the Clements, who had been working the acres and keeping the ground right, and who were visibly relieved when I told them the arrangement would hold. They had not known what would happen to the lease after Roy, they said. I told them it was staying exactly as it was. What I worked on was the farmhouse and the garden and the fence lines. I hired a contractor from town for the roof, and I painted the house myself over 4 weekends in June. The paint was the same color it had always been, Roy's choice, a particular gray-white that read almost silver in the right afternoon light. I did not change it. I learned which boards on the porch needed replacing by pressing them with my foot the way my grandfather had shown me. I fixed them. I walked the fence line in July in the early morning before work, checking the corners the way he had showed me to check them. The kitchen garden I replanted by hand. The Cherokee purple tomatoes came from the seeds in the jar on the windowsill. I could tell you they were the most satisfying plants I had ever grown, but that would be sentiment rather than fact, and I try to be a person of facts. They came back strong. The seeds had been waiting in the jar for years. They did not need much encouragement. Dennis came to see me on a Tuesday in July, without calling ahead and without telling Patricia. He sat in the waiting room at my clinic until my last patient was done, and then he asked if we could get coffee. We went to the diner on Main Street. He had a cup, and I had a cup, and he said, "I'm sorry about the contest." I told Patricia I didn't think it was right. He said it looking at the table. I didn't push hard enough against it, because I never push hard enough against Patricia about anything. That is a problem with me and not an excuse. I said. I know Dennis, he said. Dad knew too. I think that's why he didn't come to me about the trust. Not because he didn't trust me as a person, because he knew I would have told her. I said. He was precise about things. Dennis looked up at that and almost smiled. He said, "That is exactly the right word for him." We sat for 40 minutes. He paid without making it a gesture. He drove back to wherever Dennis drives back to, and I went back to the clinic. And I did not call him for a while, but I kept his number. Patricia came to the farm on a Saturday in September. She did not call first. She drove the 2 hours from Columbus in a car I did not recognize. She had apparently gotten a new one since spring. And she turned into the farm lane and sat for a moment before she got out. I was in the kitchen garden pulling the last of the late summer weeds when her car came up the lane, and I saw her through the garden fence before she saw me. She looked older than she had at the estate reading. Not in years, older in the specific way a difficult season ages a face. She had fought something and lost it, and she had the look of a person still organizing herself around the loss. I stood up and pulled off my gloves. She saw me and raised one hand in a small wave that was almost tentative, which was not a word I had ever associated with Patricia before that afternoon. I let myself through the garden gate and walked toward her, and we stood in the September light like two people who had not yet decided what this conversation was going to be. She looked at the farmhouse. At the new paint, the same gray-white it had always been, at the kitchen garden and the fence line running straight to the tree line at the far edge of the property. She said, "You have been working." I said yes. She said, "He always said you were the one who actually looked at it." She said it looking out at the fields, not at me. He used to say that Carl and June were the only ones who looked at it like it was something to understand instead of something to own. She stopped. She said, "I did not take that as a criticism at the time. I understand now that was what it was." I said, "Patricia." She looked at me. I said, "I know what you were expecting from the reading." She said, "I know you know." She said it without pretense, which I respected more than I would have respected any excuse. She said, "Joff wanted to sell it. The farm. When we thought it was ours to sell. We had a number in mind from the developer. They'd already approached us after the neighboring parcels transferred. It was a significant number." She paused. I told myself it was what made sense. That the land should go to whatever it was worth. That Roy was done with it. She looked at the fence line for a moment. I don't know if that was true or if it was convenient. I've been thinking about the difference between those two things for several months. I said, "He knew what you were going to do with it. He told Vera he wasn't doing this out of anger. He just wanted the land to stay." She looked at the fields. The Clements had brought in the soybeans the week before, and the rows were clean and quiet. The September light was doing what it does in Indiana in that month, which is make everything look like it has been exactly where it is for a very long time, and is not planning to move. She said, "He was right." She said it quietly enough that I almost missed it. We went inside for a glass of water. She walked through the kitchen, and she stopped at the windowsill. The seed jar was there, the Cherokee purple label in my grandfather's handwriting, the same hand she had known her entire life. She stood in front of it for a long time. She said, "He had a whole row of those when we were children. Dennis and I used to knock them over by accident running through the kitchen. He would just reset them without saying a word about it." I said, "He told me they grew back no matter what." She looked at the jar for another moment. Then she put her water glass down on the counter and said she should get back on the road. I walked her out. She got in the car and she put her hands on the wheel and she looked at the farmhouse one more time from the driver's seat. She said, "Take care of it." I said I would. She drove down the lane and turned onto the county road, and I stood in the yard watching until the car was gone. Then I went back to the garden. The light was still good, and there was more to do. The probate period closed in November. Lawrence Hebb called to confirm that all proceedings had formally resolved and the estate was complete. We talked for a moment about Roy the way two people talk when they have both known someone and are on the other side of it. Lawrence said Roy had been one of the more deliberate clients he had worked with in 40 years of practice. He said that did not always make things easy, but it always made them clear. I said that sounded exactly right. Lawrence said, it sounded exactly like him. The farm in October is not dramatic. It does not perform for you. The light goes low and cold, and the fields are cut and quiet. And the kitchen garden fades along the south fence and the tree line at the far edge turns the red and gold of Indiana in fall that I had looked at every October of my life and had never quite understood until I was standing on the ground that was holding those trees. I walked the fence line in October the way my grandfather had walked it, corner to corner, checking. I was slower than he had been. I will not be as fast as him for a long time yet. One morning in November I went to the barn and looked through the shelves at the back where Roy had kept his seed envelopes in an old wooden crate divided into labeled sections. I found a second glass jar, identical to mine, the same glass, the same cork, the same handwriting on the label, Cherokee Purple, 1991. Vera had told me at the estate reading that the jars were a pair. Here was the other half. He had kept it in the barn, not on the kitchen windowsill. The windowsill had been for the jar he had given away. He had been waiting for it to come back to him. I brought the second jar inside and put it on the windowsill beside the one I had carried from every kitchen I had lived in since I was 17. 2 jars, the same handwriting, the same seed in both. His and mine. A pair. Vera comes for Sunday dinners now, most weeks. My mother drives up from Cincinnati when she can make the trip. The 3 of us sit at the kitchen table that has been in this farmhouse for 40 years, technically, under the terms of the personal property division. We each own 1/3 of it, which is a fact none of us has ever raised. And we eat, and we talk about ordinary things. The kitchen table has been in this house for as long as I can remember, and it has not shifted. That is what my grandfather left me when you add it all up. Not just the farm, though the farm is real, and it matters, and I will keep it. He left me proof that someone had been watching carefully enough to see the whole shape of what I was, that a person who was precise about everything he built had looked at the question of what would last and had written my name into the answer, that the seeds he had kept through winter were the same ones I had been keeping, and that there had always been a pair. That is what family does. The real kind. It pays attention when no one is asking it to. It makes plans that fit around the shape of the person it loves, in the only language it is sure cannot be argued with, and it trusts you to find the second jar. Even after all those years. Even in a cold barn in November. It knows you will go looking. That is my story, and here's what I carry from it. One grandfather who wrote a trust before anyone knew he was going to need one. Because he had been watching carefully for a long time, and he knew what he saw. One neighbor who crossed a county road for 41 years and signed her name on a document when she was asked, and sat at a conference table and waited for the right moment to say it. And one glass jar of seeds on a kitchen windowsill that grew back, exactly the way he said they would. If someone in your life has been paying close attention to you without making a production of it, tell them you see it, before the only way they have left to say it back is a second envelope on a conference table. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who would carry it. Leave one word in the comments. I read every one, and I will know what you mean. Subscribe. Take care of what you have been given. Take care of the people who are still here. I will see you in the next one.